Good evening. My name is Kathleen Janis, and I'm a board member of Clean Elections Minnesota, a nonprofit, nonpartisan group of Minnesotans who are dedicated to maintaining and enhancing the democratic power of ordinary citizens. We are thrilled to have David Litt with us tonight. An Obama speechwriter and lead joke writer for several White House Correspondents' Dinner monologues, David's work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and many other publications. He was the head writer and producer for Funny or Die DC and is now developing a television pilot. David also is the author of 2 books, Thanks, Obama, My Hopey Changing White House Years, and most recently, Democracy in One Book or Less, How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think. Tonight, David will share highlights from this book, including thoughts about what's obstructing a government of, by, and for the people, like the effects of big money on campaigns, voting restrictions, and the Electoral College. He'll also offer solutions and is refreshingly optimistic about the possibility for fixing politics and restoring our democracy. He recommends achievable changes, recommendations aligned with the mission of Clean Elections Minnesota. David will be interviewed tonight by Pulitzer Prize winning former Star Tribune journalist Dave Hage, who has written about labor, economics, and medicine for more than 30 years and has written or co-written 3 books. Dave Hage also is a board member of Clean Elections Minnesota. On behalf of board chair George Beck, Clean Elections Minnesota, and our co-sponsors, Fair Vote Minnesota, Plymouth Area Indivisible, Congressional District 3 Indivisible, Minnesota Alliance for Democracy, and Common Cause Minnesota, please join me in welcoming David Litt and David Hage.
Kathleen, thank you. And David, welcome. Welcome to Minnesota. Thank you for spending an evening with us. And let me begin by saying how much I enjoyed your book. For folks in the audience who haven't started it yet, this book is erudite, it's infuriating, and it's hilarious, all in equal measures. And it makes me think that we're going to have a conversation tonight where we'll learn a lot and maybe have some fun along the way. So welcome. Let's plunge right in. In the introduction to the book, you write, since 1980, the number of Americans legally barred from voting has more than doubled. Since the 1990s, your odds of living in a competitive congressional district have fallen by more than half. In the 21st century alone, the amount of money spent on Washington lobbying has risen by more than 100%. And in the last decade, the odds of a bill actually passing Congress have fallen to a 50-year low. That's a pretty gloomy picture about our democracy. How did we get here?
Well, thank you, Dave, for hosting, for being the Q in the Q&A this evening. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Kathleen and Clean Elections Minnesota and all the other groups who have co-sponsored tonight. I'm really, Minnesota is one of I think I'm down to about 8 states I have not yet been to, and Minnesota is very high on my list. So at least I can make it virtually this evening, and hopefully one day, fingers crossed and vaccinations looking forward, in person as well. So let me just start off by trying to answer that question, Dave. And to some extent, the book is about both answering that question, but also just about confronting the enormity of that question. Because, I set out to write this book. I knew that there was something not great happening in our democracy. I think anybody who worked in politics during the Obama years could see that there was some real problem where it felt like what the American people wanted and what we got from our government were not always the same thing, or in other cases, when we were able to do things the American people wanted, it was much harder than I thought it was supposed to be, based on the country I learned that I lived in when I was a kid and learning about American democracy in school. And what I found was that the democracy that we're living in today is completely different than the democracy we were living in just 20 or 30 years ago. And that's true, Dave, as you pointed out, along so many different dimensions. There's tons of anecdotes and data and specific pieces. There's so many details that we can all focus on, and I'm sure we'll get to some of them tonight. But the biggest thing that I hope people take away from this book, and that I hope people sort of recognize broadly as we think about what to do to restore our democracy, is that the idea that we've always been living through a democracy like this one is just not true. The democracy that we're living in now is substantially less democratic, and I don't mean that in a partisan way, I mean that in a small d democratic way, than it was when I cast my first vote for president, which was in 2004. So there's just an enormous set of changes that have been made, and almost all of them are in the same direction. Almost all of them are about taking power away from the hands of the majority of the American people and putting power into the hands of a smaller and smaller number. And, I think to be super erudite, Dave, I would say that's a bad thing.
Great. You must have started work on this book 2-3 years ago, maybe more. And yet in its discussion of all these efforts to smother democracy, it's very timely, even prescient. Are you surprised as you look around the country today at this huge wave of voter suppression efforts that we're seeing in state legislatures around the country?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I feel like, and you've written nonfiction books and a host of nonfiction throughout your career, and you know that you always are hoping to be timely, and so you always want to be a little early to a trend. But when you're writing about something like the fact that voting rights are under attack, or the fact that money is corrupting our politics, it's very bittersweet when a year after the book came out, I sort of think, hey, I really, I saw this coming. Well, I certainly wish I had been wrong. And I think, to answer your question as directly as I can, I would say there's a few things that I find surprising and a few things I don't find surprising. I'll start with the latter half first. I don't find it surprising to see voting rights under attack the way that they are right now, because I think that for a long time, not just for the last 4 years, but before that, the Republican Party, and I don't mean all Republicans here, and certainly not Republican voters, I should say that, but a large number of Republican politicians, exemplified by Mitch McConnell, decided that it was a better idea to try to hold on to power by restricting who could vote than by trying to persuade voters to support their ideas. And that's not new in American history, but it's certainly new in recent history, and newly, it's a newly aggressive in recent history. So I am not surprised that in state after state after state, including in Minnesota, where there are the Republican election proposals that have been put forward, they all restrict voting incredibly heavily. What does surprise me is how open people are now being about it. I mean, you're seeing this, you saw it in Georgia, you saw it in Iowa, in Texas. And what you're seeing in state after state is that somebody is slipping up and saying, if we don't pass these laws, our party can't win elections. And so I do think that we're seeing a level of desperation that is, I have to say I was surprised by. I think to me, that's the big surprise of the last several months. It's not that these things are happening, but that people are being so blatant about what they're trying to do. And I think in some ways, the silver lining in that is that most Americans, and again, not just Democrats, but independents and Republicans, most American voters like democracy, even if we don't always win. And so I do think that gives me some hope. I think that there is attention being paid to what's happening. And I think that the stakes are pretty clear, and who's trying to do what is a lot clearer than it's been in the past.
Well, just to follow up quickly, do you see the potential for a backlash developing against these efforts? That is, that voting rights advocates, democracy advocates will be motivated to get people to the polls and make their democracy work better as a reaction to all these bills?
Absolutely. I don't know that the backlash will overcome the effect of these restrictive voting laws, but I do think that the backlash will be there. I think there's two actually types of backlash we're going to see. So one, and I was a speechwriter in the 2012 campaign for President Obama, and then I spent the last couple of weeks of that campaign organizing in Cleveland, in a pretty majority African-American part of Cleveland. And you could definitely see, because that was the first election cycle where voter suppression was a hot button issue. In the African-American community, totally unsurprisingly, people were extremely angry that people were trying to take away their right to vote. And there was an urgency. Nothing reminds people of how important the vote is than the lengths that some people will go to take that right away. And so you did see people sort of rally around this and say, no, even if voting is something that, maybe I feel like I'm choosing between the lesser of two evils, or I don't vote in every single election. The fact that people are trying to take our votes away, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to show them, we're going to go out and vote. I do think that there's some of that. The other thing that I think happens is voters on the fence. And, I think in a state like Minnesota, this is certainly true, where you have, it's a swingier state than most in the country, even if it's not among the swingiest in the country, where you have people looking at what the different parties are doing. And there's always this question of, are you in touch with what people are thinking, or are you out of touch? And if you've just been through the pandemic, if you're worried about, family members' healthcare or their job, and you look at one of the two political parties and they say, we know what our top priority is, making it harder for some people in our state to vote. It's not just morally wrong, it's also very out of touch. It's irrelevant to your life. And I do think that's the other thing that we're going to start to see, is that some people are going to start to say, very reasonably, why is it that one political party is so interested in messing with election laws rather than with doing things that I want to see them do?
Right. Okay. I want to move on from voter suppression per se, because your book covers a lot of ground. Dark money and political contributions, voter ID, the Electoral College. As you look around the country today and the range of topics you covered in the book, what would you say are the 2 or 3 most urgent issues that need to be addressed by folks who are trying to protect participatory democracy and voter rights?
Well, one of the things, as you sort of alluded to, Dave, I think with this book, I definitely bit off more than I could chew. And I went in attempting to do that. And I think on balance, I'm glad I did. But this really was an attempt to say, I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. But if you pick up this book and you read all the way through, you will understand all of these different facets of our democracy, how they've changed in the last 30 years, and how they all work together. Because it is, once you start pulling on one of the threads, the whole sweater starts to come unraveled. Trying to pick a couple, I would say, what are the ones where if you don't change these things, you can't change anything else? So the first is going to be the Senate filibuster. I'm sure a lot of people watching tonight and joining virtually have thoughts about the Senate filibuster. And I have to say, I was not a hardcore pro or anti-filibuster person before I started doing research for this book. But I did come away from my research and conversations I had with people pretty convinced that it is time to get rid of the Senate filibuster rather than try to modify it, so that a majority of lawmakers can pass a bill into law. So that's one element. And then the other thing in the Senate is the way that smaller population states currently tend to skew more Republican than larger population states, which means that you can have a very small number of individuals electing enough senators to block a bill. And so, I'm right now I'm in Washington, D.C. There's 700,000 people who live in D.C. That's more people in Wyoming or Vermont. We have no senators. And so as a result, you see the skew of the way that the Senate functions. The Senate is much more conservative than America is. And the House, because of gerrymandering, is also much more conservative than America is, even when Democrats are in charge sometimes. So I think that adding DC as a state, I'd like to see us add Puerto Rico as a state. Those would be ways to even out the balance in the Senate, and then ending the Senate filibuster. And then the last thing I would say that feels sort of existential is some of the voting laws that we talked about. I don't think that every one of these voter suppression laws dooms Democrats forever or ensures that Republicans are always going to win. But what particularly worries me now, and something that I did not include in the book because I didn't see it coming, are the ways that these laws are structured to potentially make it easier to overturn an election after the fact. And if that happens, if there's a legitimate election like the one we had last year and the one that President Trump tried to overturn, if that is successful on a statewide level, eventually on a national level, it's very hard to recover from that in a democracy. When you look at other democracies around the world, that is, it's not the end, but it's certainly not great. Let's just put it that way. It is extremely dangerous to get to the point where we can't agree on who wins an election.
Yeah. Well, let me follow on that. For folks who are with us tonight who want to jump into the fray, who want to take action, what are some things that people can do on these issues, such as statehood for the District of Columbia or for Puerto Rico, for reform of the filibuster? What are some things that ordinary citizens can do to advance those causes?
Well, one of the most important things is what we pay attention to as citizens. I think it's important. I use the word citizen here to mean people who live here, who are invested in their communities, in their country, right? Some people who I think of as example models of citizenship are not, American citizens, but they're still doing exactly what we all think that good citizens do in engaging in their communities. And I think one of the things, we started off tonight by talking about the ways that democracy has eroded within my lifetime. And the reason for that, the biggest reason for that, is because most of us weren't watching. We were focused on other things. And by the way, those other things were extremely important. I often think about in the Obama years, the Obama administration had a healthcare agenda, and they had an economic agenda, and they had a foreign policy agenda. We didn't really have a protect democracy agenda because we didn't realize how badly we needed it. I think it's pretty fair to say. And so that has changed. And I'm really glad to see that changing. So whether it's, all of the typical tools of persuasion, writing a letter to the editor, calling your member of Congress, donating to candidates who support what you believe in, all of these different ways of signaling to people in power that we're paying attention, that these are important issues, that makes an enormous difference. And you're seeing that nationally in the national debate today. The other thing I would say is that specific to the issues of the filibuster and DC statehood, it is really incumbent on people in states that have senators to speak up for those of us in states that do not have senators, because we're not technically states yet. I think that Minnesota has great senators. I think that like everybody, they have to figure out what their priorities are. And so to know that, if you're a senator from Minnesota, but you know that your constituents care about statehood for people in DC or in Puerto Rico, that helps move that to the top of your priority list. Where if you think, well, that would be nice, but I don't think that my voters, my constituents back home really care about it, it's just a nice thing to do, well, there might be other higher priorities on your list. So I think that becomes extremely important. And so, I'm sure that many people on this Zoom are already doing that. And so I should just say, on behalf of everyone in states like DC, thank you, because that's how this is going to get done.
There's a landmark piece of legislation in the US House, HR 1, which is the big voting rights law. If that were to pass, would it solve most of the problems that you discuss in the book? And follow up, does it have any chance of getting through the Senate?
So HR 1, and one of the things I said in the book, and I still stand by this, is that the biggest thing they could do with HR 1 is call it something other than HR 1. It makes me, as a writer, as a speechwriter, it's just like, you got to name it something with a little bit more, a little more panache. But HR 1, basically, what it signals to people who pay attention to Congress, who know the world of Congress, is that it's the first bill that the House passed, and therefore they saved that for being the bill that they think is the most important. And I agree with that. What HR 1 would the problems it would solve largely involve voting access. So it would undo a lot of these voter suppression laws that we're seeing. It would create automatic voter registration, or I believe same-day registration. I forget I think it just does AVR nationwide. But it would essentially make it so that you don't have to register to vote well in advance of the election, which would be a huge reform to giving people an opportunity to vote. It would mandate early voting, which is important. It would crack down on the revolving door with lobbyists, and former members of Congress or their staffs turning around and lobbying their former colleagues. And so it would do an enormous number of things that would make it much easier to vote. And it would change the political calculus so that if you're a Republican senator and you're facing a tough re-election, you think, well, maybe instead of trying to make it harder for Democrats to vote, which was my current strategy, I'd be better off trying to persuade some people in the middle to support my ideas, because that seems more likely to work. Once the incentives change, politicians will change with those incentives. So it would do a lot of good. The thing that HR 1 would not do is deal with the problem that I didn't see coming in my book, which is the possibility of state legislatures overturning elections. We saw President Trump try so hard to get state legislatures to do that in 2020. I do think if it had all come down to just one state and a few thousand votes, we might have seen a different outcome. We might have seen a legislature overturn an election. So that needs to be addressed, and it's not addressed in this bill. In terms of the chance that HR 1 can pass, I think, I don't think the chances are 100%, but I think they are, thanks to John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock winning in Georgia and giving Democrats control of the Senate, the chance is real. The question is going to be the filibuster. The question is going to be whether conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin come around on the basic ideas in HR 1. But I think ultimately, my guess, and I've been wrong about a lot of things in politics over the last couple of years, so take this with a grain of salt, but my guess is that we will go through this infrastructure and jobs bill that the president is pushing. We'll have a vote on that. And then once that's done, the next topic, there's not going to be any other chances to pass a bill with reconciliation, which is this majority vote process. So the only thing we're going to have to do is start to argue about these things that would have to take 60 votes. And top of that list is going to be voting rights. So I do think that we will see this come up. I think we'll see it debated. And the most important thing is that this bill is wildly popular among Americans. And I keep going back to this, not just Democrats, but among Republicans and independents as well. So if this bill is debated and the American people have a chance to see what it is and who's on which side, I think that you will start to see senators try to find a way to get to yes. But it will take a lot of public pressure to get them there.
We're getting some questions from the audience tonight that touch on the issue of bipartisanship, Democrats and Republicans working together. And since Joe Biden was elected president, bipartisanship has been a word that's on a lot of people's lips. So let me ask you about it. For example, polls show significant support among average voters and even a lot of average Republican voters for issues like gun control, climate change, even President Biden's COVID relief package, significant support, and yet they get 0 votes from Republicans in Congress. Why is that?
The short answer is because Republicans think that that strategy will work. And they look at the Obama years and they think that strategy did work. And I think that they might be right, but I also think they're running a playbook that is now more than half a decade old, and things have changed. They may be wrong about that too. So I think what Joe Biden has done that is really effective is reframed what it means to put forward a bipartisan bill. When Joe Biden is saying this bill has bipartisan support, first and foremost, I mean, he clearly would like people from both sides of the aisle to support it. I think if you look at his Senate history, he's more than willing to compromise with people he doesn't always agree with. But at the same time, he's saying this bill is bipartisan because Americans of both parties broadly support it. And it's what should not be a revolutionary idea, but after the last 4 years feels very revolutionary, that if the majority of Americans want to see something done in our democratic system, then that thing should have a fairly high likelihood of getting done. And so I think that particularly by focusing on these popular initiatives, the ones you mentioned, the COVID relief package, this jobs bill, President Biden is making a political calculus that, that voters are going to look at this and say, I don't understand why my senator or my congressperson voted against this bill, even though, everyone I know supports this kind of thing. And that may change the political calculus. So I think what we're seeing is something that it could be a last ditch effort, or it could be the beginning of something, real backslide from democracy. It really depends on what happens over the next few months and years. But it's a very all or nothing strategy that we're seeing from Republicans right now.
Well, let me follow up on that. There's a lot of research which shows that political responsiveness of Congress has declined over the last 20 years. A lot of things that a lot of Americans want: better healthcare, action on climate change, and Congress simply doesn't act on that. Do you think that average voters, average citizens are starting to figure this out, that golly, Washington just isn't listening to us.
Well, I think, I forget the exact numbers, but I think the number of Americans currently who believe that Washington, or when I say currently, this was when I was writing the book. So this was during the Trump era. I think the number has gone up since then. The number of Americans during the Trump era who believed that government was looking out for people like them was greater than the number of Americans who believe in Bigfoot, but it was close. I mean, it was very close. Mm. And so, and that's not, the week I was born, I think it was 54% or 44% of Americans felt that Washington was working on behalf of people like them. So that number has cratered. And I think one of the reasons for this, there's two reasons, one cultural and one structural. So the cultural reason is this idea of negative partisanship. What you have is, the real thing that unites Republican voters is that they don't like Democrats. And on balance, if we're being honest, and I'm a proud Democrat, but something that is very uniting for many Democrats is that we really don't like Republican politicians and the ideas that they are putting forward. And that idea of negative partisanship makes it a lot more possible not to be responsive to your own party if it doesn't agree with the most extreme parts of your base. So so for example, on climate change, you have a lot of Republicans who would like to see at least some action on climate change. But, if you're a Republican in Congress, the political incentives say, well, I can always run on, I'm not a Democrat, and I'll probably pick up their votes, but I do have to worry about a primary from an even more extreme Republican challenger. And that's the other piece of this. Because of gerrymandering, and particularly after 2010, the most aggressive gerrymander of Congress in history, certainly in modern political history, you have many more representatives who don't have to worry about the general election. The real election day for them comes on their primary election rather than in November. And we were talking about HR 1. That's something I left out. HR 1 would establish independent redistricting commissions that would create more competitive districts, and that would hopefully lead people to be more responsive toward what their voters really want.
Well, how do we unravel that? Let me ask this in two parts. First, at the narrow level, to make congressional districts more responsive so that a member of Congress really has to listen to all of his or her constituents and not that extreme base. And beyond that, do you have any hope for sort of moving beyond this negative partisanship where we all look at each other as enemies?
Yeah, I think that the sort of great debate, even though most people wouldn't necessarily phrase it this way, the great debate among people thinking about our politics right now is the culture a result of the structure, or is the structure a result of the culture? And I would fall into the first of those categories, and I'll sort of explain what I mean by that. I think that if you started to see, for example, more competitive districts because of redistricting reform, and therefore you saw more people appealing to the center, to the median voter, rather than just trying to play to their base, then then they would have to stop making these demonizing attacks on the other side. And that would lead to a decrease in this negative partisanship. So these things to me are right now are sort of trapped in a vicious downward spiral, but you could also get kind of the virtuous spiral that takes you out of it. And so I think that's what's so important about all of the issues that I tried to highlight in the book, is that some of this is cultural, but it's not like Americans have ever been great at agreeing on everything. That's never been our tradition. Our tradition is figuring out ways to find ways to move forward as a country despite our disagreements. And that's what we seem to be losing. And I think that is not, we haven't changed as a people, but the rules of the game, the foundations of our politics, that's what's changed.
Right. We can't talk about political responsiveness, Congress's responsiveness to the wishes of ordinary people, without talking about the influence of big money in politics, corporate money, PAC money, and so on. A landmark event in American politics was the Supreme Court ruling in Citizens United. Is there any hope of overturning Citizens United at the Supreme Court? And if not, what can be done about big money and dark money in politics?
So Citizens United, the question you ask is on one hand a sort of yes or no question, and then it gets very complicated. So yes or no version, can we overturn Citizens United in the Supreme Court? No. After Mitch McConnell held and Scalia's seat open, and so that President Trump could fill it rather than letting Obama fill it with Merrick Garland, after we rushed through Amy Coney Barrett's nomination confirmation with just 8 days until an election. There is such an entrenched conservative majority on the court that the question is not, can we make things substantially better? It's how much worse are they going to get because of the Supreme Court? And then the longer answer is, at the same time, Congress could expand the Supreme Court. And in my view, Congress should. And if Congress were to expand the Supreme Court and to undo the sort of procedural hijacking that took place in the end of the Obama years and the Trump years, then I think you would see Citizens United get overturned. Until all of that happens, and if it doesn't, I think the best way to think about campaign finance is Rick Hasson, who's a professor at UCLA Law School. He talks about this idea of leveling down versus leveling up. So leveling down is basically passing new laws that make it more difficult for rich people or corporations to spend unlimited sums of money on politics. Leveling down is almost impossible because of Citizens United. The only thing you can do, and it's important to do, is you could pass laws that allow transparency. So, and I believe this is actually another part of HR 1, to get back to why this is such an important bill. HR 1 would require super PACs to disclose their donors. And it would do a lot to, you could still spend, if I have $1 gazillion, I could still spend that money on politics, but everyone would know that it was me. And that would make an enormous difference because a lot of rich people don't want to be associated with these unpopular political positions. And right now they get to donate money for free and in secret, and that would change. The other thing that we could do, and I think this is much more permissible under Citizens United and that regime, is we can, what Professor Hasson calls level up. And that means it would give regular people more influence over our campaign finance. So just to use one example, in Seattle, they have something called democracy vouchers. So you basically get a $25 gift card and you can spend it on a political campaign. You can spend it on a nonprofit that's politically minded, like the NRA or Planned Parenthood, or you can just not spend it and then the money goes back to the Treasury. But what that does is, because every adult has their gift card, it's just $25, but it means that the total amount of money that is going into the system from small donors is much, much higher than it would otherwise be. And, again, if you're a gazillionaire in Seattle, you can spend a lot of money, but now you have to think about, is it really worth it? Because most of that money is still coming from ordinary people giving small amounts. So those kinds of things, they're not going to change the overall problem. They're not going to end the problem, but they can make the problem a lot less bad.
What a great example. Can you think of other examples like the Seattle voucher as you look around the country, states or localities that are doing great things to restore voter rights, protect voter rights, improve participatory democracy?
Yeah, it's interesting. What we're seeing right now is this kind of enormous divide because this issue has become incredibly important among both kind of Trump era Republicans and Biden era Democrats. And so you're seeing really creative and exciting ways of making our democracy more representative than ever, taking hold in blue states. Just a couple of examples. I mean, a lot of blue states have ended felon disenfranchisement. So, for example, in Virginia, there was a law for a very long time that said if you had ever committed a felony, you were barred from voting for life unless the governor could give you, personally give you clemency. So Terry McAuliffe, who at the time was governor, went through and he took a big box of pens and a whole lot of paper and he wrote out, I think it was 142,000 clemency notices.
Wow.
And restored voting rights for all of these Virginians. You've seen actions like that. You've seen states like New York. I'm originally from New York City. Historically, New York City has had terrible election administration. It still kind of does, but you've seen New York take real steps to try to fix their problems rather than some other states which have tried to make their problems even worse. And they're also doing matching funds. So for example, the New York mayor's race, which is happening now, and the primary is coming up, and then the election, I believe, is in November. Smaller candidates have a better shot at getting onto, kind of the main stage because you can raise a little bit of money, but then the city will match you up to a certain amount. And that gives you a chance to compete, even if you don't have a ton of money. So there are a lot of cities and states that are doing really exciting things. And one other thing I would add is automatic voter registration, which is happening at the statewide level and hopefully will happen at the national level. And that's not just states like Oregon, which has had AVR, automatic voter registration, for a while, but states like Georgia. I mean, these are popular policies, not just in blue states. And I think this is right. If you looked at the voter suppression law that just passed in Georgia, automatic voter registration was so popular that was one piece that they were going to get rid of it in the original bill, and then they had to water down their bill and leave automatic voter registration in place. So these things are popular once they happen.
Great. David, I'd like to take a moment here to remind folks who are watching tonight that we're going to be taking audience questions. You can enter them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And at this point, I think we're going to start moving into some more audience questions. There are a couple here. I'm going to ask you a double-barreled question. We have somebody who wants to know what's your view on ranked choice voting? And as a part two of that, let me say, when folks like us talk about ranked choice voting or impartial congressional redistricting, to be honest, some people, their eyes kind of glaze over. What's the most effective language to use in explaining these to ordinary folks, making them engaging to ordinary folks, and moving public opinion on things like ranked choice voting or fair redistricting?
So I think ranked choice voting, and I think what I suggest in the book was calling it majority rules voting, right? The idea behind ranked choice voting is that you never have to worry about wasting your vote, and you can always vote for your first choice.
Explain what you mean.
So the way that ranked choice voting works is rather than vote for just one candidate, you vote for a list of candidates. You rank them in the order of preference. Mm-hmm. And so, you have, choice 1, choice 2, choice 3, so on. At first, all the votes get counted out. If one person has 51% or, more than half of the first choice votes, then it's over. They win the election. If not, you figure out who has the least number of first choice votes, the fourth place finisher, a 4-candidate election. All of their votes get kind of moved back into the pool. And then all of those people who voted for that person first, their second choice gets counted instead. And you do this again. And then if that doesn't work, you go to someone's third choice and their fourth choice until you've kind of winnowed the field automatically to 2 and then seen who's the most popular. Now, ranked choice voting does 2 things. So one thing is, like I was saying, it helps alleviate the problem we have in American elections where you're often choosing between your head and your heart. And I find this with a lot of younger voters in particular, for whom voting is an expression of values. And the idea that you shouldn't choose your first choice candidate because they may not be viable, so you have to game the system a little bit and pick someone who you think is one of the top 2 candidates, but maybe you don't agree with them on a lot of important things. And, you have to hold your nose or kind of, not express your true appreciation for the candidate you like the most. Does not make sense to a lot of people who I talk with. And so it would allow you to pick your top choice and then at the same time not worry about wasting your vote. So on an individual level, ranked choice voting is great. On a broader level, ranked choice voting is great because it gives people a chance to win an election by becoming the consensus choice, by saying, I may not, let's say there's a 13 candidate primary. Often the most extreme candidate might be the one who wins, or whoever the outlier is, because the other 12 candidates will split their vote. Even if that 13th candidate is not that popular, they might win with, just 10% of the vote or something, some very small number. With ranked choice voting, that you have to be competing not just to be people's first choice, but also to say, I should be your second choice. Okay, if I'm not your second choice, at least put me third. And that means that you're trying to think about a larger number of voters than you would be thinking about in other elections. So I'm a big fan of ranked choice voting, and I'm also a big fan of changing the way we talk about ranked choice voting to be majority rules. And I think the most important thing with all of this is to make it clear, and I tried to do this in the book, to say these are not just abstract things, right? That the idea of, when we talk about redistricting reform, it's a question of when you go and vote in November for your member of Congress, is your vote meaningful? Do you actually get to have a say in who represents you, or is it predetermined by people in some sort of smoke-filled room somewhere who drew the map and cut you out of the process? Right? We generally take our rights and responsibilities as American citizens really seriously, So we have to make people understand the ways that those rights and responsibilities are being taken from us.
Mm-hmm. As we think about both federal reform, HR 1, and also these promising efforts going on around the country, it seems inevitable that some of these issues are going to wind up in court. They're going to be challenged by one party or the other. And somebody in our audience wants to know, given the large number of federal judges that President Trump was able to appoint, are you optimistic or pessimistic about how the courts might rule on these efforts to protect democracy?
I would say I'm pessimistic compared to how I think the courts should rule, but I think there's cause for concern, but not despair, if that makes sense. It is absolutely true that Donald Trump, with Mitch McConnell's help, or maybe Mitch McConnell with Donald Trump's help, really did pack the courts to an unprecedented degree. They held open all of these judicial seats beginning in 2014 and then filled them only after Trump took office. And so I believe it's now 60% of the judiciary that has been nominated by either Reagan, one of the Bushes, or Trump. And part of the problem is not just that Trump got to nominate so many judges, but that the process for nominating judges was so partisan, and that because of things like the Federalist Society, the sort of advocacy group for conservative lawyers, you've seen efforts to promote partisan judges over independent judges, particularly on the right, more so than the left, for a variety of reasons. The left tends to care more about diversity on the bench, and the right tends to care more about ideological rigidity. Mm-hmm. And you are seeing, I think, you're going to see a lot of really terrible rulings. I do think that the reason this is not a cause for despair is twofold. One is that I think, you still have many courts that have some bedrock commitment to democracy. We saw this in the 2020 elections. It's a pretty low bar to say that the courts didn't participate in the overthrow of American democracy, but it wasn't a given. And the courts did have some level, some line they would not cross. And then the other thing is, I think that as courts have gotten more political, you're also seeing people who are politically minded say, we have it pretty good. Let's not go too far here. I think you're seeing John Roberts do this a fair amount, because Congress still has oversight over the courts. Congress can expand the number of seats, not just on the Supreme Court, but in the circuit courts, where Trump added all these judges in these lower courts. And so if judges start issuing, far right ruling after far right ruling, and Americans lose faith in the independence of the judiciary, there are going to be calls to Congress to expand the size of the court, which, by the way, we should do anyway, purely for logistical reasons, because we have way more people in America than we did the last time we expanded the court. But putting pressure on Congress to exercise its oversight responsibilities is going to be a huge determinant of what the courts do. Because I think when we saw this in the court packing fight, I mean, we didn't see it, but we can read about it, that when FDR tried to expand the court, he wasn't successful, but just the threat of expanding the court caused the court to moderate itself. So I do think we may see some of that as well. So concerned, not despairing yet.
Okay. One other institution that's been in the news these last 2 or 3 presidential cycles is the Electoral College, and the fact that we've had presidents who win the popular vote and then don't wind up, or candidates who win the popular vote and don't wind up being president. You have a chapter in the book about the Electoral College. I learned a lot. I found some surprises in that. It was fascinating. But let me just say, is it time to dump the Electoral College?
Yeah, absolutely. I tried really hard throughout the book to, I have strong opinions, but I tried to sort of say, here's what someone else might think, or here's to find a counterpoint to argue against. Mm-hmm. The Electoral College is just really stupid. There's not a good reason for it. All of the reasons we originally had it no longer exist, and I go into them in the book. I'll just give you one. There's some others, but one of the reasons we have the Electoral College is because back when the country was founded, you could not have an election that took place on one day, or even over a week or 2 weeks. Because think about what the roads. It took Thomas Jefferson 6 days to travel from Philadelphia to Baltimore after when he was part of I believe it was the Constitutional Convention. During these kind of early American times, we can go to the moon and back in less time than that now. So the idea that we could do an election, it's kind of ironic given all of the fire and fury about the amount of time it took us to get election results this time around. But the idea that you could do election results in a day or even a couple of days totally was not feasible to our original founders, and the framers of the Constitution. So they created this two-step process where you elect electors, and the electors can all go and they can have a kind of one-day election to pick the president. And that's just one of the reasons we have the Electoral College, but all of the others are equally obsolete. And so, there are, I often use the Electoral College as a litmus test. If someone really truly believes that we should have an Electoral College, they either don't really know very much about these issues, or they're not making these arguments in good faith. They're just kind of, it's motivated reasoning. And that's not true of everything. I mean, there's two sides to a lot of issues, but this is one that I just don't feel has two meritorious sides.
Yeah. What are the chances of actually having Electoral College reform? And I think there's an alternative that you touch on in the book, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the point is not to get rid of the Electoral College necessarily, because that would take a constitutional amendment. And I think in a polarized country like the one we have now, the constitutional amendment is not going to happen. The chances are very close to zero. But you can get around the Electoral College through, once again, Dave, to your point, the very poorly named National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So, I'm sure everyone is at home just like fired up to hear more about this.
Yeah.
The compact is something where states would agree to give their electors rather than to the winner of the statewide popular vote. So right now, if you win more votes than the second to first candidate, than the second place candidate in Minnesota, you win Minnesota's electoral votes. Under the compact, if you won the most popular votes nationwide, you would get Minnesota's electoral votes, regardless of what happened in Minnesota. And the beauty of the compact is it only goes into effect once states, which together would make up a majority of electors, would have signed on to the compact. So it only works once it would do a total end run around the Electoral College and guarantee that whoever wins the Electoral College wins the popular vote. That's still not going to be easy to do, but we're not that many electors off. I mean, I believe it's 81. If states representing 81 electoral votes sign on to the compact, that would be enough to get us over the finish line and effectively end the Electoral College, which really could happen, I would say within our lifetimes. This is not a totally unreasonable goal. I think it could even happen within Mitch McConnell's lifetime if we work really hard.
Do you think that's something worth pushing for, that people should get behind, petitions and phone banking on behalf of something like that?
I think it's incredibly important. I do think that strangely, we are living in a period where the Electoral College clearly advantages one party over another, and probably will for a number of years. It really depends on what happens demographically with these coalitions. If your party relies on white voters without a college degree, that is incredibly helpful in the Electoral College as it's currently constructed. It's kind of a random chance that Donald Trump's coalition and the best way to kind of game the system with the Electoral College coincide so perfectly. And so the question is going to be, for example, in 2024, if Trump runs again, I think he will have a big Electoral College advantage. But if, a Josh Hawley or a Ted Cruz or, pick another name out of the hat, if that person runs, does their coalition look the same? I think it is totally worth getting rid of the Electoral College, but the danger the Electoral College poses to the country is pretty stark in the Trump era, and I'm not sure what will happen after. I mean, even in 2012, I mentioned working on the Obama campaign. I think Obama won the election by 4%, through high threes, something like that. But he actually could have lost the popular vote by a little bit, and he still would have won in the Electoral College. So it's not set in stone that the Electoral College favors one party over another, which, by the way, is why we should get rid of it. One day the Electoral College is going to elect a Democrat against the popular vote. And when that happens, Republicans are going to say, oh, we always hated the Electoral College, let's get rid of it. And I think that would be a good time to say, okay, it's a deal, even if it advantages Democrats.
Yeah. We were talking a minute ago about the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, big money in politics. And someone in the audience asks, if we can't get the court to overturn it, what about a constitutional amendment? Any prospects for doing that?
No. The problem with the constitutional amendment is that it takes a large number of state legislatures, I believe it's 3/4, to sign on to the constitutional amendment. Mm-hmm. And basically, if you needed the constitutional, the catch-22 is that if you have enough statewide support, if 3/4 of states would sign on to the constitutional amendment, then they would do other things where you wouldn't need the constitutional amendment in the first place. So the only reason you need the constitutional amendment is because you can't get the constitutional amendment because the structure of the country won't allow for it. Right. So the odds are basically zero of that happening. The much bigger concern when it comes to constitutional amendments, because of the way that there are far more red states, even though the country is roughly 50-50 or leaning a little bit toward Democrats, the population of the country, is that you could potentially see some constitutional amendments, for example, a national balanced budget amendment or a series of amendments that, are kind of conservative priorities. You could see those, gain some traction. I think we weren't that far away from it. And if there's a huge red wave at some point, you could see a real push for conservative constitutional amendments, but amending the Constitution is not going to do a lot of good for progressives for a very long time.
Okay. David, we also had another question from the audience on this topic of bipartisanship. And someone asked, under President Biden, the push for bipartisanship, someone asks, how can we expect Democrats to get cooperation from a rival party that still insists Donald Trump won the election and that democracy has been rigged? Now, we are a nonpartisan group. We're right. Not Democrats and Republicans. Let me broaden it just a little bit. Does it concern you that some large share of our political leadership and some share of our electorate kind of seem divorced from factual reality? Can democracy work under those circumstances?
Yeah, and I'm glad you did broaden this out a little bit because I'm a Democrat, personally, sometimes professionally, but if Democrats were the ones saying, we didn't win the election, we didn't get the most votes, but we want that election anyway. Mm-hmm. That's antithetical to democracy also. I would never want to see a one-party democracy that's run by Democrats because that just invites corruption and all sorts of terrible outcomes. So this is not a partisan issue. I think that there is in the Senate, you have enough Republicans who basically came around on the idea that Joe Biden was the legitimate president, mm-hmm. that you could find a coalition of people who did not want to overthrow the United States government, the duly elected United States government, and get things done with that group. And most of the people who were the most extreme when it came to democracy were equally extreme on other issues. So they're not really coming to the table anyway. In the House, it's a little bit more complicated, which is why things tend to be a little bit more partisan in the House. I mean, that's why things are happening on party line votes. So I think the broader, longer term element there is kind of twofold. One is continuing to put pressure on civil society organizations and on sort of non-governmental organizations or institutions to draw a line in the sand. I mean, I'm really disappointed. I was impressed that a lot of businesses said, we will use our political clout. We're not going to donate to anyone who, voted against certifying the results of the election. And now it's been, 100 days, and a number of those companies are starting to backslide. So I hope that consumers and activists and advocates keep up the pressure and, make sure that there are consequences, political consequences, for trying to overthrow the government. That sounds like it should be a pretty baseline thing, but these days that's where we are. And so as part of that, and the broader point is, once there's a certain set of lawmakers who have principles and would say, I believe in democracy, and I'm glad that we have a lot of them there. Then there are some lawmakers who kind of twist in the wind. And if they believe that they are less likely to be reelected if they take on these anti-democratic stances, then they're going to be more likely to support democracy, even in a baseline way. And so the important thing is to keep up the pressure so that the political incentives are in favor of saying, even if I absolutely don't agree with the people's choice in electing our new president, he or she is the president. And I think we may end up getting there. You know, a lot of people are doubling down on their sort of stances against certifying the election, but I'm not sure that's a politically wise move. And if it turns out not to be, you know, the next person coming along will learn from their mistake.
Right, great. David, we're just about out of time. Let me close with a simple question. I think it's simple. Are you optimistic about fixing democracy and getting it back to where it ought to be?
Yeah, I am. Well, let me first of all say, you know, for everyone who's on the Zoom, thank you so much for joining us. And Dave, this has been a really fun conversation. So I really, I appreciate the chance to, you know, virtually spend some time in Minnesota. And I saw that we couldn't get to all the questions. And so I just want to say thank you for everyone who asked a question. And I'm sorry if I couldn't get to the ones that I couldn't get to. But the short question, am I optimistic? Yeah, I am. We've talked about a lot of problems tonight, and I may not be optimistic in the absolute shortest term, but long term, I'm definitely an optimist, because if you talk to, you know, especially to the new generation of American voters, if you talk to American voters across the country, and, you know, as I keep pointing out, not just voters of any one political party, you know, we're a country that still believes that a democracy is better than not. And that is not true everywhere. I mean, I went to my first book when it came out in 2017. It was published in Italian, and so they said, "Do you want to go to Italy on a book tour?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I could do that. You know, twist my arm." And it was around the time when, you know, they had Salvini, kind of their Trump, was in office, and the big distinction, because everyone was sort of saying, "Oh, you know, look at these comparisons," is saying, "You're in America, you guys are supposed to know democracy. What do we do?" And the big difference was, at the time, I don't think it's still true, but at the time, he was really popular. I mean, if you look at a Putin, or if you look at Viktor Orban, who's the kind of strong man in Hungary, they're popular. And Donald Trump was never popular. Joe Biden is more popular than Trump ever was. And again, I don't think that's purely partisan. I think it's because Americans are small d Democrats. We tend to believe that we enjoy our republic, we believe it makes us special, and we want to keep it. And I think ultimately we still can. You know, it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take some real changes, and it's going to take some, you know, positions that the Joe Manchins of the world might not yet know that they're comfortable with, but they'll get there. And I think we may see, you know, the next 4 years, among much else, be kind of the resurgence, the rebirth of American democracy. And you know, the next time we're still going to be paying attention, which makes a big difference.
Great. David, thank you so much for taking the time with us tonight. We've performed a miracle. We've done democracy in 1 hour or less. And thank you for your book, Democracy in One Book or Less. It's been a real pleasure talking with you tonight. And we thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Good night.